Why stealest thou along so furtively in the twilight, Zarathustra? And what hidest thou so carefully under thy mantle? Is it a treasure that hath been given thee, or a child that hath been born thee? Or goest thou thyself on a thief's errand, thou friend of the evil? Verily, my brother, said Zarathustra, it is a treasure that hath been given me. It is a little truth which I carry. But it is naughty, like a young child, and if I hold not its mouth, it screameth too loudly.
I think it is time I started living up to my name, and began to impart some Nietzschean wisdom. I tried to figure out a way to do it in YouTube format, and decided that in every video on Nietzsche, I will focus on one little part of his philosophy. Today's video will discuss that famous quip about the whip, which is taken from Thus Spake Zarathustra, from the chapter whose opening we just heard. And the reason I chose this subject for today is that, as we can see, Nietzsche talks in this passage about truth. Recently I made a video about postmodernism, and some people had a problem with the definition of truth I presented in the last segment, the one that discusses pop culture. So I thought I would clarify it by talking about Nietzsche. First of all, let's ask, why is truth so important? Well, we all know how important it is to know the truth about people and things that we are dealing with. But what we are going to talk about in this video is the absolute truth, the truth that is universal and eternal. The absolute truth is metaphysical. It is the laws that govern our universe, and remain steady behind all the changes that we see in the physical world. Traditionally, this is what philosophers meant when they talked about truth. In Greece, in the 5th century BC, there was a conflict between the philosophers and the sophists. The sophists claimed that truth is relative, and that we should therefore focus not on searching for truth, but on cultivating virtues. When the sophists came to Athens, however, they had to confront the philosopher Socrates, who claimed that you can't have any virtue if you don't first of all know the truth, because otherwise you don't know how to define virtue. You must first of all find the absolute truth, and from there you can derive everything else. Socrates bequeathed this belief to his student Plato, and it was Plato who solidified it in Western thought. Let's focus on one of Plato's most beautiful dialogues, namely Phaedrus. It is a dialogue that discusses love, and asks if it's a good thing or a bad thing. The claim that it is a bad thing is presented first, and it argues that love is bad because it is irrational, and thus leads the lover to harmful behavior. But Plato disagrees, and presents his defense of love. He begins by claiming, and not for the first time, that a soul is immortal. He bases it on the argument that a soul is self-driven, and anything that is self-driven is immortal. The body, on the other hand, is driven by other forces, and is mortal. The body is like a prison that the soul resides in for a while, and leaves once it dies. This is a dichotomy which Plato introduced into Western philosophy, and which would lead it to create the concepts of spirit and matter. Matter is anything that has expansion. In other words, it occupies space in the physical world. Matter has no self-drive, and remains inanimate until an outside force affects it, upon which it will be animated according to physical laws. Spirit, on the other hand, is self-driven, moving by its own will. It has no expansion in the physical world, and does not obey physical laws. This matter-spirit dualism was from then on the dominant view in Western thought. The human soul was seen as belonging to the world of spirit, whereas the human body was seen as belonging to the world of matter. And while the body is subject to change and eventual decomposing, the soul is viewed as immortal, possessing a core that never changes. Back to Phaedrus. Since a soul is immortal, it means that it existed before it entered our body. Plato claims that its origin is divine, and that it dwelled in the heavens with the gods, where they would travel in a circle around the world, going through many divine planes. And sometimes, these divine beings go upwards, above the heaven, to the realm of absolute truth. Plato tells us that there abides the very being with which true knowledge is concerned, the colorless, formless, intangible essence, visible only to mind, the pilot of the soul. The divine intelligence, being nurtured upon mind and pure knowledge, and the intelligence of every soul which is capable of receiving the food proper to it, rejoices at beholding reality, and once more gazing upon truth, is replenished and made glad, until the revolution of the worlds brings her round again to the same place. In the revolution she beholds justice, and temperance, and knowledge absolute, not in the form of generation or relation, which men call existence, but knowledge absolute in existence absolute. And beholding the other true existences in like manner, and feasting upon them, she passes down into the interior of the heavens and returns home. So, the mind, which Plato defines as the captain of the soul, wants true knowledge, which can be achieved only by comprehending the absolute, eternal truth. When it dwells in the realm of absolute truth, the soul is filled with joy and knows no misery. In Plato's philosophy, this is the ultimate joy, the thing we should aspire to the most. In this state it also sees everything in its ideal form, not in the muddled form in which it appears to our eyes during our earthly existence. And because it sees the ideal form of virtues like justice and temperance, it knows how to be virtuous. So the one who sees the truth is both the happiest person and the most moral person. And absolute truth, as we see, is also the highest beauty that we could gaze upon. So the true, the good and the beautiful are all one and the same in Plato's philosophy. The soul, then, comes from a place where it dwells among the gods and sees the absolute truth. But the soul isn't as pure as the gods, and its impure parts are dragging it down. If the part that pulls it up towards the truth fails to overcome the part that drags it down, it falls to the physical world, and is born within a body. It does not remember the truth that it saw, but it still feels the yearning to see the truth, and feel that happiness again. And there are ways for it to be reminded of the truth. One is by philosophical inquiry, aimed at finding the truth. Another is by seeing beauty, because, as we recall, absolute beauty and absolute truth are one and the same. So by seeing beauty the soul is reminded of the metaphysical realm of truth. So this is what love is, according to Plato. Love is bad only if it expresses itself through sexual lust alone. But if the lover looks at his loved one as a manifestation of the absolute beauty, directing him towards the truth, then the irrationality of love is working in the service of rationality, and thus it is a good thing. So the best kind of love, according to Plato, is, well, platonic. The Phaedrus dialogue is highly metaphorical, but Plato is serious when he argues that the soul is immortal, and that it comes from the divine realm of absolute truth. He is also serious in his claim that it can find ways to remember the truth, and when it does it is filled with the ultimate joy, and becomes virtuous. So, to answer the question we asked earlier, the answer is that we should seek absolute truth because when we find it and live according to it, we live the happiest and most virtuous existence. What I want to emphasize here is that to get to the truth, rationality alone is not enough. Because there is always the question, let's say that you found the absolute truth. How will you know that it is indeed the truth? There is no authority that can confirm to us that we have found the right answer. So the authority that Plato relies on is the irrational world of emotions. We feel when something is the truth. In the same way that I can feel that right now I am awake and not dreaming, and thus know that I experience something more real than a dream, so does the one who comprehends the absolute truth feel that he experiences something more real than everyday life. When you feel the ecstasy of ultimate joy, you know that you have been reminded of the truth. Still, reason is the central thing in Plato's philosophy. The absolute truth is something that you see, something that you comprehend with your mind. There is, however, another approach. For the mystics, truth is not something that you see before you, but something that you dwell in. When you dwell in the realm of truth, in the oneness of being, you feel the ultimate joy. Rationality, for the mystics, is the very thing that detaches us from truth, because when you try to comprehend things, you are setting yourself apart from the oneness of being. It is the tree of knowledge that gets us banished from heaven. So the way to get to the absolute truth is actually to transcend rationality, by using the irrational forces of our soul. One example for that can be found in the epistles of St. Paul, in the New Testament. Paul adopts Plato's dualism, and like him regards the soul as immortal, trapped in the body, and wanting to return to the kingdom of truth in heaven. But he repeatedly mocks the philosophers who are trying to use the rationality to comprehend the truth, and claims that all they can comprehend is the physical world. Instead, it is the irrational powers of the soul that should direct us. Love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part, but when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope and love, but the greatest of these is love. So it is faith, hope, and love that will get us to the realm of truth, where we are all as one. In Plato, love was also something that can direct us to the truth, but only as an assistant to reason. For St. Paul, it is the key to truth. Right now we can see only partially, so our reason has no chance to comprehend the truth in full. But when you have faith and love in Christ, it takes you back into completeness, into the oneness of being. There, you don't need reason anymore, because you already know all there is to know. You just dwell in the kingdom of truth and experience ultimate bliss. In the Middle Ages, Paul's view was the dominant one. But in the Age of Enlightenment, we see Plato's view coming back to the fore. When René Descartes begins his philosophical project, he states that he wants to build his knowledge on certainty. So he starts by doubting anything he is uncertain of, and then builds a tower of knowledge on things that his reason judges to be certain. One of the certainties that he discovers is that God exists, and since he trusts that God is all good, and therefore not a liar, he knows that whatever he grasps with clarity must be true. Once again, then, we see this idea that our mind has a connection to the divine world, and thus can feel when it discovers an absolute truth. The tower of knowledge that Descartes builds includes all the sciences, and at its top is ethics. So, once again, we see that absolute truth leads to morality and happiness. We find this paradigm in basically all of the 17th century philosophers of Enlightenment. They all believe that we can comprehend the truth with our mind, and that we can feel when something is true, because our soul has a connection to the divine. Alas, because of the Enlightenment's emphasis on seeking the truth, it eventually exposed the weaknesses of its own axioms. By the end of the 18th century, all proofs of God's existence have been debunked, and we no longer have certainty that God exists. And without God, the whole idea that our soul comes from the divine world could not be substantiated either, which meant that there were no more grounds for the belief that our feelings can tell us if something is true or not. And so, the idea that rational thought and science could lead us to the truth had no leg to stand on. Maybe we can find the absolute truth, but without an external criterion to tell us that we have, we will never know that it is indeed the truth. By the beginning of the 20th century, this led to a crisis in our belief in science. The solution was to ditch the idea that we should build on certainties, like Descartes demanded, and instead emphasize the pursuit of knowledge. We pursue knowledge about the universe, because then we can create a better life for ourselves. In his famous article Conjectures and Refutations, Karl Popper points out that this is what every organism does, from the amoeba to the human. It uses the empirical data of the senses and logical deduction to understand the reality around it. These are the tools that evolution provided us with to navigate in the world, so these are the best tools to use to acquire knowledge. Science is the field that employs these tools, so this is what we should use. We don't know if this knowledge is true or not, but we do know that this is the best of our knowledge, the best way to ensure survival. Thus, modern thought overcame the crisis, and reason and science have preserved the rightful dominant place. But something got lost in the process. As we recall, Socratic thought made morality and happiness dependent on knowing the absolute truth. If we admit that we don't know the absolute truth, then according to Socratic thought, we can no longer establish objective morality. For some, that meant that we have no choice but to fall back on religious faith, and base our ethics on that. But secular thought did find some good solutions to this problem, showing that you can establish objective morality, even if you don't know the absolute truth. The bigger problem is, what about happiness? Humans all over the ages have reported a powerful joyful experience that they felt once they believed they connected to the absolute truth. It has been called all sorts of names: illumination, revelation, satori, etc. But if it didn't actually come from connecting to the absolute truth, then where did it come from? And how can we reproduce it? The religions claim that they know the answer, but secular thought, once it ruled out absolute truth, does not. And for some people, giving up on this experience of ultimate joy is too much to ask for. So, to compete with religion, secular thought needs to answer this. If the joyful experience that Plato and the mystics reported on did not actually come from connecting to the realm of absolute truth, where did it come from? One path towards a possible answer comes from a movement that in the 19th century became the adversary to the Enlightenment movement, namely the Romantic movement. While Enlightenment wanted to shed light on everything, to see it as it really is, Romanticism sanctified the darkness of night, where everything becomes one. It was, then, a revival of the search for the mystical unity that St. Paul describes, the perception that truth is not something that you comprehend but something that you experience. Some of the Romantics were religious, but others were atheists, so they could not say that this mystical experience comes from uniting with the divine world. So the question becomes, where does it come from? Well, consider this. If there is no God, no divine realm, then there's no real grounds for the dualistic approach that divides existence into spirit and matter, which means that our soul is not an independent being trapped in the body, but body and soul are both part of the same system. And that opens up the possibility that our feelings actually connect us to the forces that are moving the universe. The energy and forces that are driving us are the same energy and forces that are driving the stars, and our feelings give us an unmediated connection to them. So, by examining our feelings, we are actually examining the foundation that the universe is made of. Friedrich Nietzsche came at the end of the 19th century, after decades of such musings. Eventually, he hypothesized that the universe is made of what he called will to power. As we recall, we've defined spirit as self-driven and having no expansion in space, whereas matter expands in space but is not self-driven. The will to power, as Nietzsche defines it, is self-driven and has expansion in space. In Nietzsche's universe there is neither matter nor spirit. There is only will to power, and the will to power is both the stuff that makes up all the bodies in the universe, and the force that is moving them. This concept is hard to fathom at first, so I'll try to make it easier. Let's take the traditional materialistic approach that believes that the universe is made of matter. Think of an atom that floats in space. This atom is impenetrable, and nothing else can enter this part of space as long as it occupies it. This atom is wholly made of matter, which means that it has no self-drive. It will move only when outside forces work on it and move it. Now, imagine that instead of matter, every single body in the universe is actually made of force. Our atom will still be impenetrable, still occupy that part of space, but it is self-driven, moving itself, and clashing with other similar bodies, or combining with them to create a more powerful body. If you can imagine that picture, you'll get close to the universe that Nietzsche envisioned. Note that this means that every atom has will. More accurately, it is will. So every atom and every composite body have feelings, including what we call inanimate objects. The difference is that they don't know that they have feelings. A star is basically a big ball of happiness, burning with immense power, but it doesn't know that it is happy. It just is. Only bodies that become organic and develop brains and self-consciousness are aware of their own happiness or misery. Note also that in this universe there are no laws. Every atom is self-driven, and they clash in total chaos. But when they get together to form composite bodies, their wills cancel each other out, so these bodies would behave essentially the same in similar situations. That is why we can find laws that allow us to predict how they will behave. But if we could descend to the atomic level, we'd realize that there are no laws. Now, like I said, we are living at a time when we have regained a lot of our confidence in science and rationalism. So believing that the stars have feelings, and that the universe is made of force, sounds like, well, Hollywood fantasy. But there is still a big problem right at the heart of today's rationalistic thought. Science does not explain where consciousness and feelings come from. The answer is usually that this is one of the questions that science will figure out eventually, but I have to call bullshit on that. If you believe that the universe is made of matter, something that has no drives or feelings, then you will never be able to bridge the gap and explain where consciousness and emotions come from. To me, it seems a lot more reasonable to assume that they are already baked into the stuff that makes up the universe, and this intuition is one of the things that makes Nietzsche's philosophy more appealing to me. For the sake of science, we assume that the universe is made of matter, which obeys strict mathematical laws. And science, I agree, is the way we should acquire knowledge about the universe. But if we are not doing science, if we are discussing questions like happiness and morality, we don't have to be bound by this view. Back to Nietzsche. The worldview that I described is something that he developed only in his later writings. In his early writings, the will to power does not appear yet. But he already believes, as someone who comes from the Romantic tradition, that reality is chaos, and rational explanations of it are just constructions that humans impose on it. These rational explanations are necessary for us to be able to function, but there are ways, especially through art, in which we can make these constructions break down for a while, and immerse ourselves in the chaos of existence. The result, said Nietzsche, is a powerful, joyful, ecstatic experience, which he called the Dionysian experience. For early Nietzsche, those Dionysian moments of total disintegration are the most joyful experience a person can have. But there is another joyful experience that he mentions, and that is what he calls the feeling of power. The feeling of power is achieved when you manage to impose your will on something. For a thinker like Nietzsche, the greatest feeling of power is when you manage to create a theory that explains the known universe. Thus, you've imposed your will on reality, and the result is a very strong and joyful feeling of power. In his early writings, the feeling of power and the Dionysian experience stand in opposition to each other. The kind of existence he espoused was that of trying to live a powerful life according to your will, but every once in a while to give yourself up to the total loss of power, as you are being taken over by the ecstatic disintegration of the Dionysian experience. This helps you recharge your energy, so you can go back to yourself and your powerful existence. Driven by these insights, he finds his philosophical mission. In his book The Gay Science, Nietzsche sets on a venture to create a worldview that will enable him to enjoy everything in human existence. The Enlightenment thinkers saw things like uncertainty, pain, and mortality as bad things, and were hoping science could eliminate them. Nietzsche regards this hope as a sign of weakness, a sign of wanting to live a comfortable life instead of a heroic and exciting life. Instead, his gay science aspires to rationalize reality in a way that will regard such things as good and necessary things that we welcome because they actually make our life better. So, the first difference between gay science and regular science is that the latter is concerned only with the physical world, whereas gay science also includes an exploration into the psyche. Gay science must create a worldview that explains all the physical phenomena as well as all the psychological phenomena. The second difference is that gay science seeks not just to explain the universe, but also to change our mentality, create a stronger mentality that enjoys things that heretofore brought it suffering, such as uncertainty, pain, and mortality. The Gay Science is a philosophy book, written in Nietzsche's usual aphorismic style. There is a certain spiritual voyage that he goes through in the course of the book, although it is hard to detect if you read only this work. But Nietzsche then took this voyage and gave it literary form, in his next book, Thus Spake Zarathustra, and it is of this book that we talk in this video. One of the insights put forth in the Gay Science is the realization that God is dead. In other words, that the Western psyche has reached a point where it lost its belief in God. Nietzsche presents it as a catastrophic event, which the people of his time do not fully grasp its repercussions. Western thought has based its truths, its morality, and its perception of happiness on God, and once you've removed God, everything might collapse. There have been thinkers before him who were atheists, but they continue to base their thought and their values on concepts that make sense only if God exists. If we don't fundamentally change our values and create values fit for a godless world, warns Nietzsche on the cusp of the 20th century, then Western society might be facing a catastrophe of epic proportions. The realization that God is dead, then, brings suffering to Nietzsche, and gay science requires that he creates a worldview that regards the death of God as a good thing. The character of Zarathustra starts out with this realization, and sets out to create a new philosophy for a post-God world. Thus Spake Zarathustra, in its original form, had 3 parts. Today's editions include the 4th part as well, but we shall ignore it because it was written later. In the first part, Zarathustra is mainly going around and making speeches about various subjects. One of the chapters in this part is called Old and Young Women, from which I quoted in the beginning of the video. In this chapter, Zarathustra meets an old lady, and she asks him to speak to her about women. Zarathustra obliges and preaches his views on women, and as usual with Nietzsche, they are quite misogynistic, especially by today's standards. Basically, he claims that men and women have a different nature. Women are superficial, and constantly change with their changing moods. Men are deeper, so they are more stable. The man is drawn to the volatile nature of the woman, and finds joy and inspiration in interacting with it. The woman should obey the man, to find order and deepness in her life. The old woman then thanks Zarathustra for his lecture, and as a reward she says she has a little truth to tell him. Zarathustra asks for this truth, and she says, "Thou goest to women, do not forget thy whip." So, the old lady is pretty kinky. Indeed. And partly she expresses Nietzsche's view that the man should be the one in control, and not allow the woman to reduce his drive to power by giving in to her impulsive nature. But there is also a deeper philosophical idea behind this little story. As we recall, Nietzsche does not believe that there are laws that govern the universe. In other words, there is no metaphysical realm, there is only the ever-changing physical reality that we are immersed in. Which means that the woman, who is changing along with this reality, is actually more connected to it, whereas the man's need to find some stable form behind it all actually detaches him from reality. Zarathustra wants to live a truthful life, and it turns out that the ones who live more truthfully are the women. He would like to live as they do, but he is a man, so he needs the deepness to be happy. He needs to impose a structure on the chaotic physical reality. He must therefore find the way to reconcile between these two wishes. In part 2 of the book, Zarathustra begins to develop new philosophical ideas. In the chapter called On Self-Surpassing, he begins by mocking those philosophers who say that they are seeking the truth. He claims that what really drives them is the wish that everything would be comprehensible to the human mind. It frightens them to think that existence is ultimately undecipherable to us humans, so they must keep the blind faith in the claim that human reason can understand the universe. And so, they made the search for truth the ultimate goal of philosophy. Instead, Zarathustra presents his hypothesis that everything is driven by will to power. This is actually the moment when Nietzsche introduces this concept into his philosophy. The will to power wants to overcome, to feel like it is in control. So what actually drives these philosophers is not the wish for truth, but the wish to impose their will to power on the universe, to find a structure that explains it and thus allows them to master it. But Zarathustra claims that the universe is chaotic and has no structure. How can he square his need to impose structure on it with his realization that there is no structure that complies with reality? Zarathustra's solution is self-surpassing. What we should do is create temporary structures, ones that explain all of our current knowledge. The new structure must also be more powerful than the previous structure. In other words, it should find joy in things that previously brought you suffering. The new structure is joyful for a while, but then your will to power demands that you destroy it, and create an even more powerful structure. Thus, your life should be a life dedicated to self-surpassing, to periodically creating yourself anew, surpassing your former self and emerging as a more powerful one. And with that, he fuses together the two joyful experiences into one. In the self-surpassing, you experience both the feeling of power, as you create a structure that explains existence, and the Dionysian experience, which you go through as your old self disintegrates. In later books, Nietzsche would change his definition of the Dionysian experience, and would attribute it to what you experience while self-surpassing. The old definition, that involves no self-creation but is just about self-destruction, he would now redefine as the Romantic experience. Nietzsche, then, rejects both the Enlightenment and the Romantic movements, seeing them both as weak and decadent. Enlightenment philosophers, he says, were weak in that they wanted to use rationality to shield themselves from the irrational and chaotic nature of existence, whereas the Romantics were weak because they wanted to immerse themselves in the irrational, while giving up on the rational powers of the mind. In contrast, the Dionysian man gives expression to both the rational and the irrational, and uses them to become more and more powerful. Thus, Zarathustra finds a way to reconcile between his need to find a structure that explains existence and his belief that existence has no structure. And he also provides us with the thing that we were looking for, an alternative theory to the source of the joyful experience which Plato and Paul described. The ultimate joyful experience, according to Nietzsche, is not the result of connecting to the truth, but is due to the power that we feel when we impose our will on reality, combined with the ecstasy we feel when our old self dissolves. In some places, Nietzsche even refers to these structures as truth, and it actually shares a lot with the traditional definition of truth. The structures that the Dionysian man creates, these worldviews that he imposes on the universe, must be compatible with all the known facts, and must also not contain any self-contradictions. There's this myth about Nietzsche, as if he didn't care if he contradicted himself. This is a bullshit claim, created by interpreters who were too lazy to understand his writings, so they used it to justify the self-contradictions in their own interpretations. The structures that the Dionysian man creates must have no self-contradictions, because then they would not produce the feeling of power. So, actually, the Dionysian man is quite similar to the traditional truth-seeker. So, Zarathustra has defined his quest. He must develop his insight that will to power is the force that drives all beings, and explain existence based on that, and his explanation must fit all the known facts, both those of the physical world and those of the psychological world. In later books, This will develop into the theory we presented earlier, where the entire universe is made of will to power. Here, he is just trying to create an ethics to live by, an ethics that will include and justify a life of constant self-surpassing. The ethics that Zarathustra presents basically poses an end goal for this process of self-surpassing, an end goal that will be achieved when he learns to find happiness in every aspect of human existence, an end goal which he called the Superman. The Superman is someone who can take anything fate throws his way, and enjoy it. By aiming himself towards the Superman, he creates a reasoning to justify the self-surpassing. But in the beginning of the third part, Zarathustra realizes that there is a self-contradiction in his idea of the Superman, a self-contradiction that he cannot resolve. Thus, he reaches a crisis point. The nature of this self-contradiction will take too long to explain here, and we shall discuss it in future videos. Here, we will just say that it eats at him throughout part 3, and eventually makes him collapse. But then, he comes up with a new worldview, a new structure, which solves the problem. Thus, he surpasses his former self, and re-emerges more powerful. The result is a rapture of joy, the likes of which I have not read in any other literary work. Zarathustra doesn't speak in this part, he just has beautiful visions, as his soul is singing its love and affirmation of the universe. And this is how the book ends. In one of the visions, in a chapter called The Second Dance Song, Zarathustra imagines life as a seductive woman, a woman he desires. But she is sneaky, and she leads him on a chase that is in the form of a dance. Finally he catches up with her, and he tells her, "Thou witch, if I have hitherto sung unto thee, now shalt thou cry unto me. To the rhythm of my whip shalt thou dance and cry. I forget not my whip, not I." This, then, is the true meaning of the whip. With the ethics of repeated self-surpassing, Zarathustra has found a way to satisfy his need to impose structure on the world, while at the same time remaining step to step with ever-changing reality, in a never-ending dance. The whip represents two things. First, that he is now the master of his life, making it bend to his will. Second, that he is going to whip the juice out of it, make it scream for him, draw out every bit of excitement and power it can give him. And so, in a world without God, Nietzsche gives us an alternative that enables us to go on searching for truth, not for the rationalist scientific reason of acquiring knowledge, but for the spiritual Platonic reason of experiencing ecstasy. It is the ecstasy felt by a scientist when they discover a theory that works, an artist when they manage to give form to a new vision of the world, an inventor when they create a new technology to control something, and so forth. It is the truth of the moment, a truth that best fits the universe as we know it, a truth that gives you the Dionysian experience. At some point in the future it will no longer be the truth, but we don't live in the future, we live in the now, and right now it is the truth. The Nietzschean man lives for these moments, the moment when he connects to the truth of the time, the moment when his whip leaves its mark on the fabric of life. And this is what for me, as a Nietzschean, is so sorely lacking in postmodernist thought. Michel Foucault is seemingly the embodiment of the Nietzschean ideal, constantly changing and presenting a new worldview with every book he wrote. But while Nietzsche describes it as a liberating process, in which whenever he creates himself anew he breaks free and soars into the heavens, Foucault does not believe that freedom and truth are possible. Nietzsche's regenerations involve defining his new self, whereas Foucault tries to escape definitions, and he tries to remove himself from his philosophy as much as possible. Foucault offers no ecstasy. The closest thing postmodernism has to offer to the Dionysian experience is Jacques Lacan's concept of jouissance, which was picked up by several postmodernists. But this concept is not Dionysian in the latter sense. It is Romanticism. The pleasure comes only from destroying, not from creating something new. The postmodernists may have adopted many of Nietzsche's ideas, but they cut the heart of his philosophy out. It was pop culture that, unknowingly, became the true manifestation of Nietzsche's ideal. The spirituality of pop is Dionysian spirituality. Every musical pop style of the 20th century, from the earliest forms of jazz to the latest forms of electronic dance music, have been ecstatic outbursts of joy. Every style had its own unique ecstatic experience, which for the fans of the style became the center of the world. The fans would judge every record by its ability to produce that experience, and would determine if it is real or fake. If a record is real, it makes you feel like it connects to the truth, purified from all the untrue elements of existence. The fans would form a worldview around that experience, and create a group identity. And this is one of the big differences from Nietzsche. Nietzsche regarded the truth to be individual and personal, but it turns out that when you have a Dionysian experience, and express it in music, there are other people who can feel it as well. And those people get together to create a happy community. If you want an example of this process, check out my series on psychedelia. In time, pop culture started to develop self-awareness, and the Nietzschean consciousness emerged. The pop kids realized that the ecstatic experiences don't last, that the musical style that once gave them the ultimate joy loses its power after a few years. In other words, that there is no eternal truth, but every truth is only of its time. Thus, we've realized that to live a truthful and happy life, we need to periodically change. The man who articulated the philosophy of pop is the man who is the biggest influence on my life, much bigger than Nietzsche, a man who has lived out the Nietzschean ideal more than any human I know, and improved on it. In the future, I will talk a lot more about David Bowie. For now, I will just say that he was the artist who dealt with all the problems that come with living this kind of existence, and came up with solutions. One of the biggest questions Bowie had to deal with was the moral question, a question which Nietzsche, in my opinion, fails to give a good answer to. How can we establish a code of morality in an existence of shifting truths? The answer is too complex to be given here, but I will point out just two things. First, if truth is a changing thing, it means that your current truth will not be your truth a year from now. That means that you must maintain a pluralistic society, a society where no one can impose their truth on others, a society that will allow you to change and express your new truth. Secondly, as we pointed out, truth is shared with other people, and you get together and form a happy unified community around it. That means that you must regard all humans as your brothers and sisters, even those who aren't part of your current community, because they might belong to a community that you will be part of in the future. With such insights, pop culture has established its ethics. But we are stepping out of the boundaries of this video. Like I said, this is meant to be the first in a series I will do on Nietzsche, and it is also a video meant to complement my video on postmodernism, explaining the concept of truth I relied on at the end. As we see, it comes from basically splitting Plato's concept of truth into two approaches. One is a scientific approach, which gave up on the joyful experience, and is about acquiring knowledge on the universe. The other is an aesthetic approach, which focuses on the experience, and is about exploration of the self. When you create a worldview that liberates parts of yourself that were repressed, it produces a powerful ecstatic experience, and makes your life better. The ideal of the pop age is to be in control over the changes in your life, whip the juice out of it in order to have the most powerful spiritual experiences, and remain in contact with the truth of the time. This is the main thing I am exploring, and it is something that I will elaborate on in future videos. This video just aims to set a philosophical groundwork. And all of this discussion came from that one little line about the whip. I hope I also helped to clarify what Nietzsche meant by it. As we have seen, it has both the literal meaning and the metaphorical meaning. The metaphorical meaning cuts right into Nietzsche's ethics, and is very influential on my life. Now as for the literal sense, as for Nietzsche's sexist notion that when you go to the woman you should bring the whip, I have to say that I strongly disapprove. Let her get it herself, the bitch.